It's a great honor to welcome once again to the show Matthew Continetti. He is a journalist, a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and the author of three books, the most recent of which being The Right, the 100-Year War for American Conservatism, now on paperback. Welcome back to the show, Matt.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Let's begin by me asking you about your semester at the American University. How was it? What did you do?
Well, it was a very pleasant semester. For the past several years, I've been teaching a semester-long course, typically in the spring at American University, on conservative political thought. But as I tell my students on opening day, I've tricked them into really a history course. And so the course is essentially a history of American conservatism and American politics since the 1920s, which, of course, is the topic of my book, The Right. So it's essentially teaching my book. But as in most history courses, you kind of get sidetracked, or you kind of spend time on certain areas of particular interest to the students. And so you never really run up to the contemporary moment. We ended this semester by discussing the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991. So we covered the years from 1920 to 1991. But it was very pleasant. And I think my main takeaway, Chong, is that many students have a hunger for historical learning because it was not taught to them at the elementary or secondary school levels in any lasting way. And so much of what I was telling my students about 20th century American history was new to them, and they had great interest in it. And so I found that rewarding because I was able to introduce them into this remarkable story of 20th century America.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And I'm glad you pronounced my name correctly.
Well,
the paperback edition of The Right, I'm guessing there's an extra afterword. So tell me about what that entails.
You're right. There is a new afterword to the book. Basically, the first edition, the hardcover edition of The Right, ended with Joe Biden's inauguration, which now is, of course, quickly receding as history itself. And so this paperback edition takes the story through the 2022 midterm elections. And so it's an afterword covering the past several years in American politics, and also the past several years in the history of the right. And so I discuss the development of national conservatism, national populism, the new right that is increasingly a part of conservative discourse.
Mm-hmm. Right. I want to zero in on a passage that you wrote in the book towards the end, I believe. I quote, "Indeed, the rise of liberal critics of woke racial equity politics may portend a new center, potentially a new neoconservatism, based on the classical liberal principles of individual freedom, personal responsibility, equal opportunity, merit-based achievements, and color blindness." So, of course, having been a reader of your book and a great enjoyer of it, I believe that aside from neoconservatives ourselves, I suppose, most people in the political sphere think of that term as very hawkish in foreign policy, and that's about that. So tell me about this new neoconservatism in which you are seeking.
Sure. Well, one of my missions in life is to complicate people's understanding of what neoconservatism is by talking about its history, and specifically its development, beginning with a critique of domestic policies and domestic American society in the 1960s. the first neoconservatives were anti-communist liberals. That is, they were against the Soviet Union. They supported a strong defense, but they were also liberals at home, meaning they voted for Lyndon Johnson in 1964. They voted for Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice president, in 1968. They supported the New Deal. They supported the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But beginning in the 1960s, they came to an understanding that the Great Society was not only failing to achieve its desired results, it was making matters worse. And they arrived at this conclusion through the use of social science. Many of the neoconservatives in the beginning were trained in social science, so empirical study. And when they studied the anti-poverty programs of the Great Society, the criminal justice methods of the Great Society, they found that all of these policies that their fellow liberals were putting into place in the 1960s were not working, and indeed making problems more difficult to deal with and to solve. So the original neoconservatives began as skeptics of the Great Society and of government intervention in the economy and the culture. And they were also increasingly disturbed by the rise of the counterculture in American universities, kind of the rebellious attitude of many students, the idea that the students knew more than the professors, the notion that the campus should be a site of political activity, not disinterested inquiry into the truth and to into liberal education. Some of the more bohemian tendencies of the counterculture, free love, drug use, the sense that kind of traditional bourgeois middle class values were oppressive. Neoconservatives didn't like any of this, and so they began a movement to the right. It was only much later, decades later, that the term became associated almost entirely with a hawkish foreign policy and support for democracy around the world and American global leadership. Mm-hmm. So when I say a new neoconservatism, I'm thinking of writers typically associated with Bari Weiss, the journalist, and her Free Press. Someone like though he might not like the term, the writer Thomas Chatterton Williams, who has written about race in America, I think, in a very nuanced fashion. Even a figure like the Substack writer Matthew Iglesias, or even at times, and I don't want to ruin anything, any tendency, but Ezra Klein, the New York Times columnist, all of them are arriving at certain conclusions about the state of the left that are similar to what the original neoconservatives were thinking 60 some years ago. That is, they look at the left and they see that the left's radical elements are predominant, and that many left-wing policies are not actually making things better. Just as an example, some of the writers like Iglesias and Klein are focusing on how environmental regulation and what's called not in my backyardism, NIMBYism, lead to land use policies that restrict development and increase the price of rents and homes, thus exacerbating American inequality and making the lives of middle class and lower class Americans much more difficult. So this is an emerging property. I don't think it's quite at the level of a neoconservatism quite yet, but it's something to watch, I think.
Mm-hmm. I guess two cheers to the new neoconservatism. And
right.
I suppose the Free Press by Bari Weiss could be something like akin to the Public Interest or Commentary back in the day.
Perhaps, you know, The Public Interest, founded in 1965, really as a journal of social science. Irving Kristol and Daniel Bell, the original co-editors, they wanted to use good social science to basically expose bad social science. It was a very small circulation journal. Irving Kristol used to joke that he was suspicious of any magazine that had more than 700 subscribers. But he just wanted the right 700 subscribers, the people who were in positions of power or able to influence the culture. The Commentary magazine, which you mentioned, founded in 1945 as part of the American Jewish Committee, then became basically the premier intellectual journal in America for many decades, having a intellectual trajectory that is of great interest, parallel to, of course, its longest-serving editor, Norman Podhoretz. Like Irving Kristol, Podhoretz began, unlike Irving Kristol, Norman never had a radical youth, but in early adulthood, he was an anti-communist liberal. Then, unlike Irving Kristol, he kind of went through a radical phase in his early middle age when he published many of these new left writers that the folks at the Public Interest were horrified by. But then beginning in 1970, Norman Podhoretz turned to the right, became a major neoconservative figure. And at the age of 93 is still thinking and speaking, not really writing so much anymore, but his mind is as active as ever. I think that the editors of the Free Press, and some of these Substacks that are going on, my former employee, Charles Lehman, who's a scholar at the Manhattan Institute, has a Substack and also a podcast called Institutionalized, which he hosts with Aaron Sibarium, a writer for the Washington Free Beacon, which I co-founded. They at their best, they approach the old neoconservatism of Public Interest and commentary.
I see. I did have Charles Lehman on the show, so the episode will be probably in August, will be uploaded.
Great.
So I read a review of your book from one John O'Sullivan, whom I've already had a great pleasure of meeting. And it was published in the Claremont Review of Books, which you are not too friendly with in your own book, The Right. So I quote, with The Right, your book, Matthew Continetti has written a fine, comprehensive, and readable narrative of the rip-roaring history of American conservatism with its amazing repertory company of statesmen, philosophers, and eccentrics. It's a remarkable achievement and a great read, but one over-influenced by the insurrection, he puts it in quotes, referring to January the 6th, and the blowback to it that took place when its final pages were being written. So I guess, how would you respond to that?
Well, I was happy to see the review. It was a great it was nice. It was great to be praised by John O'Sullivan, someone that I've long read and admired. One of the editors of National Review, of course, Buckley's successor for a time, William F. Buckley Jr.'s immediate successor. He, not to get in the weeds, it's a positive review. I was very happy for it. I think we essentially disagree on the meaning of January 6th and also on Donald Trump's conduct after the 2020 election. And then later he says that I don't quite understand either Reagan or Irving Kristol, and I also disagree with that judgment. I think we just have a difference of opinion of both figures. But like I said, I was happy to see the review. I thought it was a fair review. I thought his criticisms were in good faith. I wouldn't say I'm not unfriendly to the Claremont Review of Books. I have stopped my association with it, as was reported in the New York Times Magazine. But it does continue to publish very good writers, and I do read it every issue. In fact, I think it's interesting because I've noticed some differences between what the Claremont Review publishes and what other Claremont outlets say and do and publish. And I think that distinction within the Claremont Institute, which has become a very important institution on the new right and the conservative movement as a whole, is something to follow.
I think, yeah, we haven't discussed this in our previous chat, but tell me about the Claremont Institute. Like, do you believe that it has taken a turn towards the worst, so to speak, with the ascension of Donald Trump?
Well, it's I think departed in several respects from its original intention. Often institutions do that. The Claremont Institute was founded in the late 1970s by students of the political philosopher Harry Jaffa. Jaffa was a student of Leo Strauss. He was the author of, I think, one of the best books on American politics and on Abraham Lincoln, called Crisis of the House Divided. He was someone who became convinced that the right should stand for the principle of equality as expressed in the Declaration of Independence. And he was a critic of other parts of the right throughout his career. It's not unusual for the writers and thinkers associated with the Claremont Institute to be critics of conservatism as it's broadly understood. Situated in California, they have a detached perspective on what happens in Washington. And so Jaffa critiqued traditionalist conservatives. He critiqued libertarians. He critiqued neoconservatives. He critiqued basically everybody, leading to the famous quip by William F. Buckley Jr. that, if you think disagreeing with Harry Jaffa is hard, try agreeing with him. And Jaffa changed his view of the founding and of America. In his first book, Crisis of the House Divided, he basically argued that Lincoln reworked the constitutional order to make it align with the Declaration. In a way, he transcended the founding and refounded America through his rhetoric and through his actions during the crisis, during the Civil War. By the time Jaffa wrote the long-anticipated sequel to Crisis of the House Divided, a book called A New Birth of Freedom, which wasn't published until the year 2000. Crisis came out in the 50s, to give you some perspective. Jaffa had revised his view to essentially say that Lincoln was in concert with the founders, that the founders themselves knew this project had to develop along certain lines, that the Constitution was much more intricately connected to the Declaration from the very start, and that America essentially was, in its best, the ideal regime, long considered a utopian by the classical political philosophers. So he himself changed. So I think what's happened, though, since Jaffa's death a decade ago, is that parts of the Claremont Institute believe that America has become so corrupted now that something like a revolution is necessary to return to or to reanimate the founding principles of the nation. Politics as usual, put it that way, are no longer enough. And I think that sentiment was present for a long time in Claremont scholarship and writing. It became more visible after the financial crisis and with the rise of the Tea Party. And then it certainly became so with the rise of Donald Trump. I mean, a Claremont associated writer named Michael Anton wrote the Flight 93 election essay in 2016, became one of the most important intellectual arguments surrounding that election. Rush Limbaugh read it aloud on the air. And basically, Anton's argument is due to mainly immigration, though he also said the wars in the Middle East and trade, but mainly immigration. America was on the verge of collapse. It had been hijacked, right? Just like Flight 93, it was going to crash. So you might as try storming the cockpit with Donald Trump. That mentality that America was basically over. And so we had to resort to measures that we would not normally use, or that we would think are unthinkable or even nasty, became more present in the Claremont universe over time, and leading Anton and some other people there to embrace this person who writes under the pseudonym Bronze Age Pervert, for example, who's a former Straussian himself, and who essentially is kind of giving, dime store Nietzschean, almost a parody of Nietzsche that appeals to young people, and essentially is basically a gateway drug to authoritarianism. That all of that, and of course, it was the Claremont associated lawyer John Eastman who was very central to Donald Trump's attempts to overturn the election in 2020. All of that, I think, has put the Institute in a very a position at odds, certainly with the conservatism I believe in. And I think if you go back and read Harry Jaffa, I'm not even sure Harry Jaffa would agree with a lot of the positions that Claremont associated writers espouse these days.
Mm-hmm. So conservatism Inc. That's what Michael Anton call you guys.
Well, I think that's a stupid phrase for a lot of reasons. Because one thing, if there was a conservative intellectual establishment circa 2015, that establishment certainly doesn't exist in 2023. Trump destroyed it. So to the degree that there is a conservatism Inc., it doesn't include people like me. It includes people like the Claremont Institute, the new conservative Inc. The most important institutions in the conservative movement today are places like Claremont, places like Hillsdale College, institutions like the CPAC, which is run by Matt Schlapp, and now the newly reborn Heritage Foundation, which has aligned itself with the way of thinking that you see in the institutions I just named. So they are the conservative Inc. I mean, I also think it's a stupid phrase because as you study the history of the right, as I did to compose my book, there is no monolithic entity. That's one of the main themes of the right. There's not one, executive suite that is determining the policies of the American right. Now, there had been a consensus for many years that it was an intellectual consensus that was basically the result of observance of empirical reality, that traditionalist conservatism and free market conservatism were not opposed to one another if they could both find their roots in a view of the Constitution of the United States of America as their guiding light, right? And there was certainly a consensus. I mean, here the consensus is very long-lasting since the Cold War, that America ought to be the global leader, and that America ought to be the guarantor of international security, and that if America perceives threats, then America needs to act boldly and unilaterally, if necessary, in order to defeat them. What I find when I look at the new right today is immigration, trade, they increasingly take a backseat to a revulsion at American power, and a revulsion of America on the world stage, and a belief that America does not deserve to be the global leader, right? That, again, America itself is so corrupted that why should we be leading anything? Why should we be helping people? What do we really stand for anyway? That, I think, is now more and more an important part of the new right, and it's again something that I strongly dissent from.
Mhm. So of course, Anton's storming the cockpit moment has happened on January the 6th, 2021. And you conclude your book by mentioning that in February of the same year, the FBI indicted L. Brent Bozell IV for crimes committed during January the 6th. And I'm quite fascinated by how I think the Bozell generation, starting with number two, has um has been quite undermentioned in the analysis of conservative analysis. Of course, Bozell the second was the co-author of, I believe, McCarthy and His Enemies, a pro-McCarthy track with Buckley, and he was also his brother-in-law, I believe. So yeah, tell us about the Bozell generations. How have they got to this point?
Well, I can't speak with any authority on that track. All I can say is what I report in my book. I do know something about L. Brent Bozell Jr., who was a Oklahoman. He was in the Merchant Marine in World War II. He went to Yale, and in 1946, along with William F. Buckley Jr., part of that generation who had to delay their education because of the Second World War and their participation in it, their service in it. And he met Buckley. He became fast friends with Buckley. They were debating partners. They were both excellent rhetoricians. Bozell converted to Catholicism. He was a rock-ribbed anti-communist. And as you say, he married into the Buckley family. Brent Bozell Jr., brilliant man, had his demons. He began association with National Review from its outset at 1955. He had worked with Buckley on that book you mentioned, McCarthy and His Enemies, which was published in 1954. He ghostwrote speeches for McCarthy. In 1960, when a group of conservative communicators and donors thought that Barry Goldwater needed to lay the predicate for a presidential run, Goldwater said, "Sure, but I need a ghostwriter for this book you want me to write." And that ghostwriter was L. Brent Bozell Jr. And so he wrote Conscience of a Conservative, which is the defining text, I think, of the conservative movement, especially in its historical aspect. There it's said that the conscience of a conservative is pricked by anyone who would impinge the dignity of the individual human being, the sense of individualism, the sense of freedom. Freedom is the goal, maximizing freedom. But about over a quarter of the book is taken up by foreign policy and the importance of what eventually would be called peace through strength and resistance to the Soviet Union, eventual rollback of it. So Bozell was a great orator. He spoke at a Young Americans for Freedom rally, in which Ronald Reagan appeared. And in fact, at that rally in the 60s, Bozell spoke about tearing down the wall that divided Berlin. And it is believed that that phrase may have stuck in Ronald Reagan's memory, leading to his famous speech at the Brandenburg Gate in 1987. Eventually, Bozell became very committed to his Catholic religion. He had spent time in Spain, which was then ruled by the general Francisco Franco, who was, in addition to being an authoritarian military ruler, an ally of the Spanish Church, Spanish branch of the Catholic Church, and an anti-communist. So he admired Franco, and eventually breaks from National Review over an argument about the position of freedom in politics. And this is in the 1960s. And he begins to think that virtue is the main object of politics and of government. Government has a place in inculcating virtue. And he forms his own magazine called Triumph Magazine. She says it's a radical Christian journal. That was his name for it. It was kind of his description of it. And Triumph intermittently published over the course of the 60s and 70s, became increasingly critical of America, harshly critical of America, American foreign policy. The Triumph sided with the Black Panther movement and their radical challenge to the American way of life and political structure. So this was an alienation of Bozell from what was mainstream National Review conservatism. And his critique of not only mainstream conservatism, but also America is seen today, I think, by people who embrace the traditionalist half of the American conservative tradition. So if you read the pages of the American Conservative, or if you read the authors in Compact online magazine, right? They are radicals. Their social traditionalism, their social conservatism has led them to a point of alienation from America as it exists today and harsh criticism of it. Often, again, focusing on American foreign policy, but then going back to the society that produces that foreign policy. So one lesson of Bozell, I think, of studying his career is that critique is always present in American conservatism on the American right. It just needs to be taken up in different ways in different generations. It didn't really affect his one of his sons, L. Brent Bozell III, who was a mainstream conservative and founded the Media Research Center, which was continues to be the main kind of institutional critic of the mainstream media.
Well, I was thinking about the current Barry Goldwater that the new right is, allying towards Ronald DeSantis of Florida. And I think we've mentioned this in our last dialogue, where you said that before COVID happened and before he became a very popular figure, he was a Reaganite through and through. But nowadays we see him, handpicking people for the board of trustees for one Florida college, because he thinks that people are being indoctrinated with, critical race theory, as he calls it, as well as waging war against the Walt Disney Company, because he believes that they are indoctrinating people with critical gender theory. With Christopher Rufo, who I also had a chance to meet briefly, has become kind of like the brain of that operation. So I guess my question is, well, does Ronald DeSantis's popularity, like increasing popularity as a conservative vehicle, says anything about the change that conservatism is undergoing?
Well, I think Governor DeSantis is running for president. He announced his presidential candidacy. He is currently number 2 behind Donald Trump in polls for the Republican nomination. He's far back. I think he's some 30 points behind in averages of national polls as he launches his campaign. So to the degree that he is maybe a barometer of how strong the new right is, you say, well, you can look at his support nationally and say, well, it's definitely there. It's present. It's significant, but it's not dominant, right? Trump is dominant. Is Trump part of the new right? Yes and no. I mean, Trump is his own thing. He can change on a dime. He helped, I think, break through the barriers that had basically kind of kept the new right from real authority within the Republican Party, and even in many conservative line institutions. But when I look at Donald Trump, I do see just a very kind of archetypal American populist. You see them throughout the history of the United States of America. kind of tribunes of the people who emerge. They speak on behalf of a segment of the population. They indulge in conspiracy theory. They point fingers. They say that the way to solve America's problems is to throw out the corrupt elite and put the populist leader in charge. That's not quite new right. I mean, it has some overlap with the concerns of the new right, but it's not quite the same. DeSantis, on the other hand, seems to be much more technocratic. He's not actually a populist. Wait, when you think about it, he's somebody who understands institutional power, which institutions usually give populists a lot of trouble because once they're put into positions of power, they don't really know what to do with them. DeSantis does. DeSantis has a supermajority legislature backing him, and he's been very strategic in his fights, whether it was his fight with business over COVID mandates and COVID vaccine mandates during the pandemic. His fight with Disney, I think, was very strategic at the outset, but he's since been tripped up a little bit by Disney under its new old manager, the CEO, Robert Iger. But the fight with Disney emerged because DeSantis's and the Florida state legislature passed the Parental Rights in Education bill, basically limiting or banning discussion of sex and gender in the grades K through 3. And the response of Disney was to say that this company was going to do everything in power to reverse this law, which I think most people, when they understand the details, believe to be common sense. So DeSantis was on firm ground when this fight started, but it's since kind of slipped out of his hands because of some very clever legal work by Disney. DeSantis' control over the new College of Florida, where he's been selecting the trustees, as you say. He also he wasn't directly responsible for it, but of course the appointment of former Senator Ben Sasse to be chancellor of the University of Florida system was significant. So he sees definitely education as a main battleground of in our cultural politics. I think he's a very shrewd and intelligent leader. I think he presents the most significant challenge to Trump. But we're going to have to look to see how far that new right message of institutional culture war will travel. In some ways, Trump's message, the MAGA populism, it's proven to be popular within the Republican Party for sure, right? And it's also more, I think, comprehensive. That is to say, Trump can talk about the economy. He can talk about foreign policy, right? He's going to solve this Ukraine thing in a day, right? He also will talk about culture, but he can talk about anything. Whereas I think DeSantis up to this point has focused mainly on the culture war. And when he's waded into, say, foreign policy, he's tripped himself up. And he has actually little to say about economic policy, which, to me is interesting because most people rate the economy as their number one concern in this age of inflation. So I think DeSantis has a lot of work to do, but I wouldn't underestimate him. He's a talented politician.
I also like to mention the national conservative movement that's growing these days, especially after your book is published. So their version of Barry Goldwater lies in Hungary, being Prime Minister Viktor Orban. And I think it informs me a lot, because their version of conservatism is much more European than American. And they have these conferences, right? And as far as I know, they are mostly held in Europe, right? Unlike the CPAC. And I'm not sure how much influence they have over the American public discourse at large, but as a challenger to, I guess, your version of conservatism, they are quite a force to be reckoned with. So, how would you answer their challenges?
Well, I think you kind of put your finger on it, which is that national conservatism contains insights, I believe, but it's not, to me, germane to the American experience. If you read the National Conservative Manifesto, there's no mention of the Declaration of Independence, of the principles of political equality that, again, as I mentioned, Harry Jaffa believed ought to be central to the American conservative understanding. Its view of federalism is kind of askew from an American perspective. Its view of religion is cuts against kind of the American experience as well. It believes that the majority religion ought to be basically upheld by the state, which is not really how Americans have conceived of religion in public life. I mean, America, I think, and American conservatives believe that religion should have a place in public life, but not necessarily that public institutions should be promoting one sect, religious sect, right? I mean, that's seems to me to be contrary to the First Amendment, right? So there are various aspects of the national conservative agenda, which I just don't think really relate to the American experience. There are other parts of national conservatism which I think could be included in a constitutional conservatism of the sort that I espouse. The whole reason to be a constitutional conservative is that you believe that the American Constitution provides the space for traditional ways of life, that indeed the First Amendment protects religious liberty and religious expression so that religious communities can be left untouched by the government, which has traditionally been the most hostile force against religious freedom. The separation of powers prevents any one particular faction from taking over political power, thus providing a check on cultural excesses that you might disagree with. There was one other aspect of the National Conservative Manifesto which I thought was just kind of unrelated to the American experience, and that was its support for a moratorium on all immigration. Now, typically when American conservatives talk about stopping immigration, they mean illegal immigration. That is to say, they want to, address what is happening on the southern border of the United States. The National Conservative Manifesto is against all immigration, illegal or otherwise. I do think that America has always believed in legal immigration. That is, the contributions that immigrants to this country make to our society, to our economy, to our culture, that America is a place where people of all nations and cultures can come and improve their social position, provide a better life for their children and their grandchildren. And I think we've seen that happen. This engine that is America, that is able to take people from peasant conditions overseas, and then within 3 generations allow them to rise to top positions in our politics and in our society and our culture. So I think constitutional conservatism is supportive of immigration, even if it says, well, we need to find ways to restrict illegal immigration. So for all those reasons, I think national conservatism, well, has some insights. I'm not saying that China isn't important, or that the tech companies present new challenges that we need to think through. But we need to think them through in ways related to the American constitutional system and the legacy of the American founding. That, to me, is what makes American conservatism distinctive and worthy of support. And so this is why I think any type of internationalist nationalism, like you see in the NatCon movement, should be viewed critically, because what makes American conservatism distinctive is its reliance on on the tradition of freedom. And it's that tradition, I think, that needs to be protected and extended.
Right. So final question. I think we've touched on this in the previous one, but I think one or two important questions that belie every conservative, intellectual or otherwise, is what are you trying to conserve and against what? So I guess those two are for you.
Well, like I was saying just a moment ago, I think American conservatives want to conserve the legacy of the American founding, which is a legacy of freedom that is embedded in our constitutional structure. And so it's a tradition. It comes out of, it's present in the Declaration of Independence with the ideas there in the preamble, and also implied in the Bill of Particulars against King George. But then in 1787, it is institutionalized in the Constitution, the world's oldest democratic constitution, one that has stood the test of time, one that protects individual liberty through the division of power, and allows us to live and flourish in this continent-sized republic. So that is what I think an American conservative needs to defend. So who are we defending it against? Well, we're defending it against, one, challenges from outside. And so these are external threats to the constitutional order, to the United States of America. And that has always been my priority, is national security and foreign policy. Right now, there are many threats, ranging from an imperialist fascist Russia to the emerging superpower of China, to the continued threat from radical Islam, as evidenced in the quest of the Iranian government for nuclear weapons. There are many external threats. Those are the threats that come first. Within, what are the main threats to the American constitutional structure, to our country? Well, one, there's a long-standing threat from the progressive left, which dislikes the Constitution for the very reason that I like it, right? I like the Constitution because it protects individual liberty through its structure. That is, it prevents any radical moves, any sudden moves when it works best. It is constructed to increase deliberation and sensible debate. The progressive left does not like it because the progressive left wants the executive, or primarily the bureaucracies that are part of the executive, to regulate our lives in furtherance of what they take to be the common good, the progressives. So we need to defend the Constitution against the progressive left. But unfortunately, the left does not have a monopoly on threats to the Constitution. There seems to me to be present on parts of the right today a similar dislike of the Constitution, because the Constitution is not giving the right a monopoly on power, and because the Constitution contains structures and procedures which thwarted Donald Trump's attempt to remain in power after 2020. And the Constitution also contains its amendments, including the First Amendment, which does limit, I think, the ability of any government to interfere in private decision making. So you ask what I defend. I want to defend the Constitution as amended, understood in light of the principles of the Declaration of Independence and of the American political tradition. And we need to defend that foremost from threats to our country from without, but also against the tendencies of the progressive left and the radical right within.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, thank you very much for joining the show, Matt Continetti, once again.
Thank you, Chong.
All right. I look forward to seeing you in person when you do visit Hungary, and I guess transfixed by Viktor Orban the same way I guess Black radicals are transfixed by China and Mao Zedong, I suppose. Of course. Until next time.
Okay, until next time.